Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Star Wars Starfighter for PC, Xbox, PlayStation 2, and PlayStation Network. This is a space combat game by LucasArts. It was originally released in February of 2001 for PlayStation 2, and it later saw release on Xbox and PC with the PlayStation Network re-release coming out this year. And it's oddly enough something of a rarity. We didn't really get a lot of Star Wars space combat games. I mean, we had the old school X-Wing and TIE Fighter games that were actually space simulation games, but then we had something like Starfighter or the Rogue Squadron games, which were more of an arcade space combat experience. And while the Rogue Squadron games have a lot to draw on with the original trilogy, this one unfortunately is centered around the prequel trilogy. More specifically, it's a tie-in with The Phantom Menace, which, as we all know, is a complete atrocity. But even with that tainting this game, I was perfectly willing to give it a shot, simply because it's a space combat game, and I am a sucker for space combat games, even if they're based on a movie as terrible as The Phantom Menace. So with that in mind, I decided to give it a fair shot, and the question there really becomes, how is this thing as a space combat game? How does it stack up against the likes of, say, Rogue Squadron? And is it something that manages to overcome its absolutely horrible movie that it's tied in with and actually become something much greater? Well, as far as presentation goes, you do have to keep in mind this was a 2001 release and it was originally released on PlayStation 2. That said, it looks about typical for the PlayStation 2 era. Nothing is particularly greatly detailed. Some of the modeling and animation is really choppy. Textures are pretty low res. The game doesn't run in a widescreen resolution, so what you're seeing here is actually corrected for aspect ratio. But rather than just being bad looking, they just look dated, and that's simply because the game was released in 2001. For its time, it looked just fine, and nowadays it just looks like a PS2 era game. There's nothing really negative about that other than the fact that you might need to overcome the fact that you're probably used to a hell of a lot better looking games than this by now. But there is one aspect about the visuals themselves that is noticeably problematic, and that is the pre-rendered cutscenes. When you're in engine, it looks just the same as everything else, it's just with the actual game assets. But when you get to the pre-rendered cutscenes, for lack of a better word, they just look absolutely horrible. They remind me of mid-90s CGI in just how crappy they look. I mean, the animations themselves are very, very choppy. Modeling looks really awkward in them. The video files themselves are pixelated as all hell because they're pretty low resolution. And it just looks plain ugly. It's beyond simply looking dated. It looks ugly. And then there's the sound design, which is a combination of Star Wars sound effects, which, as always, are pretty solid stuff. LucasArts has always done that pretty well. The John Williams score, which was, of course, one of the very few redeeming qualities of The Phantom Menace. Although I do have to say, Duel of the Fates to training missions is pretty ridiculous. You reserve Duel of the Fates for something really epic and awesome, and yet here it's just thrown in as the very first mission's soundtrack because reasons, I guess. And it just doesn't work very well. And that's part of the problem that the music in general has. While it is very good, because it is, of course, John Williams' score, it's just not necessarily timed as well as it could be, and you don't really feel like it could really fit in well with what you're doing. I mean, training missions to Duel of the Fates. Do I need to say more than that, really? But then there's the other aspect of sound design, the voice acting, which ranges from pretty awful to corny B-movie at best. And most of it is just kind of grating on your nerves. I mean, one of your main characters, Reese, is just, well, cheesing it up to a degree where it's actually pretty annoying rather than endearing.
Okay, Wrench, time to show Asara what we can do.
And that's what happens for most of the voice acting. It's either just flat out bad, or it's cheesy to the point where it just is annoying. So instead of being charming, the presentation overall just ends up being either meh or downright irritating. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story starts out with you playing as Reese Dallows, who is a member of the Royal Naboo Space Fighter Corps. And he starts out by going on a training mission and then providing escort for the Queen of Naboo. And of course, things go horribly wrong, and the Queen is forced to flee into hyperspace, while Reese and his mentor Asara are forced to fight off a horde of mercenary ships. And she doesn't make it, but he does, and he gets rescued by a character named Reti, who introduces us to the second playable character, which is Vanna Sage, who is a mercenary that at the beginning of the game is employed by the Trade Federation to help them test out the Scarab Starfighter. And of course things go wrong with that as well, and she ends up going over to Eos, which is a volcanic planet. And that leads us into the third playable character, who is Nim, a pirate. And their paths all intertwine when they ultimately go up against the Trade Federation, and that's pretty much it, really. There's really not much to the plot in this game. It is extremely simplistic. And it has one really nasty problem that is attempting to make you care about things that you could not possibly care about. For example, Asara. You basically have no idea who this character is. She starts off the game as, oh, well, obviously it's the player character's mentor. Except she's only in the game for 2 missions before she's killed off, and you don't really get any sort of characterization from her other than, oh hey, she's a character. And the main player characters really aren't all that interesting either. I mean, Reese is, like I said before, kind of annoying simply because of the voice actor. Vanna and Nim aren't particularly interesting either. They're slightly more interesting than Reese, at least, but that's not saying much. And ultimately, what little story there is just ends up being completely lost in what you're actually doing, which is really the main problem with Star Wars Starfighter. You see, it's a space combat game, as I mentioned before, and you basically have 3 different ships that you can take control of, all of which have slightly different abilities. You have your main laser cannons, and then you have your secondary weapon. For the Naboo ship, it is a time-based locking proton torpedo, where you have to hold the reticle on the target for a certain period of time before your reticle turns red, and then you can launch it and it will home in and hit the enemy. Vanna has a tagging ability that assists in taking out enemy ships, and Nim also has an explosive capability that is capable of actually injuring you if you get too close to the explosion, so you got to keep in mind that. But that's the problem. This game is ridiculously simplistic. The vast majority of your objectives in this game are to destroy pretty much everything in your path, and that's pretty much it. On occasion, you might have an objective to destroy a very specific target, but you're still destroying stuff. Other times, it's protect this. Okay, well, that necessitates destroying things. And yes, I get that it's a space combat game, but there's a noticeable lack of variety among the various playstyles between these 3 different characters, as well as the actual objectives that you are going on. So you would think it would either fall to the story or the actual flight combat mechanics to really pull things up, and they don't. I mean, as I mentioned before, the story is just barely even there and you don't give a crap about it. And the actual flight mechanics are where the game just really falls flat on its face. Now, it should be noted that I did play this on PC with a joystick, not a gamepad, and it was just incredibly simplistic. You have your main trigger and you have your secondary trigger, and then you have a button to switch between the various targets for auto-targeting, or there's one for manual targeting. You have a boost and a brake, and that's how you control your actual throttle instead of actually having throttle controls. So it's all ridiculously simplistic. And then you throw in the fact that I wasn't really expecting this to be what it is. See, what I was expecting was basically Rogue Squadron only done with the Episode 1 theme, and that would have been fine because Rogue Squadron was a damn good game. And yet it's not like that. You see, in Rogue Squadron, you feel like you're really in control of a badass starfighter. You have definite handling characteristics. It has a noticeable amount of weight to it and such like that. Whereas when you play Starfighter, the movement is ridiculously floaty. it feels more like a 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter than it does a full-on space combat game, except it's not a 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter. See, if it were a 6 Degrees of Freedom shooter, I would be able to be okay with that, because I played the hell out of Descent and absolutely loved Descent, but when I play Starfighter, it's just awkward. And their idea of difficulty is throwing in a lot of enemies at you and just sort of stun-locking you. And by that, I mean they just constantly throw off your aim whenever they hit you. It just starts shaking your screen around to where it's just getting more and more difficult to aim at things. And that's pretty much it in terms of difficulty for this thing. Just throwing in a bunch of enemies and having them just knock you around a bit instead of being able to actually outsmart you or things like that. The enemy AI is pretty dumb, and so is the friendly AI for that matter, but regardless, you're dealing with a game that is simple on a level that is just incredibly unsatisfying, and I'm really not sure who this was made for. It's not entertaining for a space combat fan. It's not a very good Star Wars game. It definitely doesn't really add anything to the Star Wars lore, and it actually suffers from some of the same narrative problems that the Phantom Menace did, which is amusing as hell. But it ultimately just feels like a cheap cash-in. And while you could certainly do a hell of a lot worse, it's just not really an entertaining game. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.